Romania's largest protest since 1989, touched off by a law that would let government officials get away with stealing. Is this just a local political crisis, or does it have broader implications for the country and its place in Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jane Dutton. $48,000. It's more than many people earn in a year. And now Romanian politicians may get away with stealing almost that much money without fear of prosecution. A newly issued decree decriminalises government misconduct if the money involved is less than around $48,000. And hundreds of thousands of Romanians say that undermines decade-long anti-corruption reforms. The government says the move will decrease prison overcrowding, but it has touched off the largest protest the country has seen since the fall of the communist government in 1989. Demonstrators are calling for the government to resign, but even after days of riots, the ruling party is refusing to withdraw the decree. We'll get to our guest in a moment, but first, David Chater sets up our discussion from the Romanian capital, Bucharest.
This emergency decree passed by the ruling Social Democrats came overnight on Tuesday, and it was very unexpected, and the day was actually called a day of mourning by the president, Karl Iohannis. He said a day of mourning for democracy. It seems eventually to have rolled back the idea of the corruption drive here in Romania and in Bucharest. There have been 3 days so far of protest here in Victory Square with the cabinet offices behind me. Now, the numbers have been something like 150,000 in this square, but across the country more like 250,000. And this weekend we expect a huge swell of protesters to focus in here on this square. There's been nothing like this since the demonstrators forced out the communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu in 1989. There has been an extraordinary reaction to this emergency legislation, which essentially says that if you are involved in corrupt practices but the money involved is below $47,000, you will not face a prison term. Now, this is quite extraordinary. The President of the EU Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, is watching the developments with alarm. It seems to be rolling back a decade's worth of slow progress against the corruption drive here in Bucharest and throughout Romania. So it's being watched with growing alarm by world leaders as well. But it does seem there are some legislative handicaps on the route to passing this legislation. The Senate itself, the upper house, has said they will not consider the legislation and they have to pass it. Also, the Attorney General is bringing the case to court, as is the President, who said he will take it to the Constitutional Court and order it to be struck down. So at the moment we're waiting to find out exactly what will happen, how many protesters will appear here, and whether it will move the Social Democrats to repeal this emergency legislation.
Romania's Constitutional Court says it will review the decree next week, a move supported by President Klaus Iohannis, who opposes the measure. Here's what he had to say.
I have to admit, even if it's very hard for me, that the situation in Romania is very complicated. But we have hundreds of thousands of my Romanians out on the streets, and I trust them. I trust my people. I believe in Romania, so in the end, I'm convinced that we have to find good solutions. The rule of law has to prevail, the European values have to prevail.
EU leaders have warned Romania that they're watching the developments with great concern, and the embassies of the US, Canada and several European countries released a statement saying the decree can only undermine Romania's standing in the international community and risks damaging partnerships that are based on common values inherent in the guiding principles of the EU and NATO. Let's bring in our guests. In Bucharest, we have political analyst Alexandru Coeta. In Brussels, Paul Ivan. Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. And also in Bucharest, joining us on Skype, Laura Stefan. She's an anti-corruption campaigner and former director of the Romanian Ministry of Justice. Very good to have you with us. I really appreciate it. We're obviously going to look at the bigger picture of what's going on here, the impact on the EU and European relations. But Alexandru Coieta, let me start off with you. How is it possible that this sort of decree is even being considered? What's going on?
Yes, well, first of all, good to be on Al Jazeera, even though the situation in Romania is not probably the happiest to discuss. You should know that this decree came under discussion a few weeks ago, and from the outset it stirred a big discussion in Romania and even got the president involved a couple of weeks ago when the government was set to table for the first time this ordinance, this decree. The president went so far as to sit into the government meeting, and that was said to prevent the cabinet from tabling it. So this is really a question of reversing more than a decade-long struggle to fight corruption, to clean up the Romanian political class, and to bring Romania on par with the best standards at an international level.
I mean, I get that, but I'm just wondering how
largely
this was considered feasible, a good idea, how anyone would benefit other than crooks.
Well, I mean, this obviously is the pretense that this decree serves to relieve overcrowded prisons. It obviously doesn't fly. This is a decree, an ordinance that is actually aimed to help corrupt politicians. And the fact that it is being pushed by the Social Democratic Party, which has a history of endemic corruption within its ranks, I think it is no coincidence. So this really should be seen as a fight of a corrupt political class that struggles against existing legislation to decriminalize its deeds and get away with stealing public money. It's really that simple.
Paul, Ivan, do you think it's okay?
Well, it's certainly not okay what's happening in Romania. What they are trying to push, what the government is trying to push. As you mentioned, we see a very strong public reaction. We have hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. We have protests also from the judicial system, from the president, from Romania's international partners. There's a lot of pressure on the government to actually take back these decrees, but so far we are seeing that they are refusing to do this. And actually, it's quite extraordinary that they push them these decrees, though the opposition was already there, extremely visible, both inside the country and outside. The protests have actually started several days before these decrees were pushed and were enacted. So they don't seem to care very much about them, and we can clearly see that there's a very direct interest of some of the politicians at the top of the Social Democratic Party to actually weaken the criminal codes, because they themselves would benefit as a result of these changes and as a result of a weaker criminal code and a weaker rule of law in Romania.
Is this where the figure 47 or 48,000, depends how you do the exchange on this number, is that where that figure comes in? I mean, why that figure? Why is it considered acceptable to steal $47,000, $48,000?
Well, they argue, they found an argument for it. At the same time, we see that in the current case where the leader of the Social Democratic Party, because though he already has a criminal conviction, he's also has a second trial. The sum in question, it would be below that below the sum you mentioned. So this would very clearly impact on his trial. Very much helping him. It's a very good question. I mean, why should Romania decriminalize abuse of office below this sum? Very clearly, the population doesn't agree with this. it's clearly one of the main reasons why people are on the streets. At the same time, that's not the only change that they put forward with these decrees. There are a number of other changes which weakened the criminal codes and which received a bit less attention.
Yeah, that often is the case, isn't it, where you push something rather controversial while you slip the other laws in. Laura Stefan, as an anti-corruption expert, what do you make of the message here and the amount of money? I mean, is the message saying to others that it's actually okay to steal up to this amount of money?
Well, in the beginning of your show, you talked about how a person is likely not to make so much money in a year. Well, in Romania, many people may not make so much money in maybe 5 years or 6 years. So you see how unacceptable this is for the Romanian public, which looks at it and thinks, why should it be okay for them to steal something that I work my entire life to make. So obviously this is unacceptable for the general public and brings people in the streets. My biggest concern with these events today relates to the procedure. We are quite worried that if we allow this to pass through, and if we don't oppose it, and if we don't force the government to withdraw these emergency ordinances, they can do anything tomorrow. I mean, any piece of legislation is under a big question mark. You can go to sleep in one country and wake up in another. I mean, the government adopted these pieces of legislation. So what is your concern if this
does get passed? I mean, the knock-on effect, what sort of legislation would really make you sit up and think that something's going horribly wrong?
They can dismantle the anti-corruption prosecution office. They can dismantle the organized crime prosecution office. They can take away the status of magistrates from prosecutors. They can do whatever. I mean, there's really no limit, because they had protests in the street and still they adopted this piece of legislation late at night. They allegedly met to discuss the budget of the country, but at the end of the day, it turned out that they adopted this legislation. And that immediately brought about 15,000 people of Bucharest inhabitants in the streets.
And Paul, I believe there's a feeling within the government, those who are pushing this through, that anti-corruption measures have been politicized for a long time now. Is that true?
We hear this sort of excuse, but actually if we look at the statistics, if you look at the cases, you can see that the Anti-Corruption Directorate has really investigated and has prosecuted people from all the parties, from all the parties from Romania. And at the same time, just some days ago, the leader of the Social Democratic Party has praised the Anti-Corruption Directorate. So really that's not an argument that can fly. No question about that. I mean, we see people that were very close to the former Romanian president, Traian Băsescu, which were prosecuted, even members of his own family. So honestly, that's an extremely weak excuse and accusation.
Is this also a weak accusation? I think, Alexandru, you were saying that it possibly is. The fact that this measure will help ease the overcrowding in Romanian prisons. I mean, this really begs the question, how many corrupt politicians are there in prison? Or is it a case of the prisons being just too small?
Well, I mean, the question, the problem of the overcrowding of the prisons is nothing new in Romania. Nor is Romania the only country that had this problem. Let's remember that Italy had the same issue tabled a few years ago in 2013, when they passed a law that provided a similar relief, although not to my knowledge for corruption-related crimes, to relieve the prisons. So this is really nothing unique to Romania, the overcrowding of the prisons. And in fact, I would argue that this is really just an excuse that the Social Democrats and the more specifically Liviu Dragnea, the chairman of the party, are using in order to pass a legislation that they have been trying to get through for many years. And the reason why they are doing it now is because it's merely 2 months, I think, since the general elections that PSD, the Social Democrats, won by a large majority. So really for them, this is as good a time as any to pass this legislation. So there's the feeling among the majority that it's really an existential struggle for the fate of the politicians that have problems with justice. And the cost, the political cost, because undoubtedly the ruling majority will bear some political cost for this, what is happening now. Also, the costs in terms of Romania's credibility abroad are worth in order to get corrupt politicians out of prison, in order to stop ongoing trials like the one that Liviu Dragnea himself is involved into for offenses which are related to abuse of office, which is the main crime that's being basically stricken away, is being decriminalized. So this is really a brazen attempt to get politicians out of trouble and to wipe clean the records of those that have been convicted for crimes like abuse of office in the past.
Laura, how effective will this be in clearing up and releasing space in prisons, and how many people do you think will be affected by this, will be released, will be allowed to continue spending up or taking up to $48,000 a year?
Nobody knows. This is the honest answer. Initially, the Minister of Justice made an evaluation, we don't know based on what, but he said that between 2,000 and 2,500 people are going to be affected by the pardon legislation. However, the pardon legislation has been significantly amended and sent to the Parliament. So we don't know what will go out of the Parliament. The decriminalization, the partial decriminalization of abuse in office, again, is probably going to affect a few hundreds of people, if so many. So obviously, this is not going to have a big impact on the population that is in the penitentiaries today.
Okay.
We've been arguing forever that this is just a pretext, not a reason for these regulations to be adopted overnight.
And so if we push this on a bit, I mean, does it raise the question of, do you think Romania was fast-tracked too quickly to the EU? Were the reforms not entrenched enough to allow it into the EU?
No, I actually have a more positive view on this. I think that what we see today is the counter-reaction to a very efficient fight against corruption. I think if you see this kind of struggle, this kind of political crisis in Romania, you see it because the anti-corruption agenda was successful. So I would also look at the part of the glass that is half full, not at the half empty one.
Alexandra, you were nodding there. Do you agree with that? And if so, where does it leave its position within the EU now?
I happen to agree. Yes. I agree with Laura. I don't believe that the argument that Romania was fast-tracked into the EU in 2007. I think Romania has had an ongoing problem with corruption, but at the same time, Romania is not the only European problem that has been having problems with corruption. Look at, I don't need to give examples because the viewers obviously know that other countries, particularly in the south of the continent, have the similar problems. And so I think that, really taking up this argument that Romania was pushed into the EU when it was not ready to become a member really is not the case. And like Laura pointed out before, indeed, Romania did make significant progress in terms of fighting corruption, especially in the past 3 years, when the results by the Anti-Corruption Directorate were absolutely spectacular in a good sense. So really, we are witnesses to a backlash of a very successful fight against corruption, because the politicians in Romania are now afraid to the point where they would risk the credibility of their country, where they would risk the future of their own political party just to get away with criminal offenses and take this threat, let's say, off of their shoulders, the fight against corruption.
Paul, if we pick up on that comment about corruption in the EU, something else we're seeing in the EU and Europe, the rise of populism, what we've seen in Hungary through Orban, and the illiberalism that we're seeing, the shutting down of democracy in some places. Is Romania exempt from that?
I think it's quite a complex situation, because we see a rise of populism in several European countries, and of let's say, governments governments that try to abuse their position and the fact that they have a majority. We see challenges to that, rule of law in Poland, in Hungary. But I think Alex was especially referring to corruption and the fact that obviously there is corruption in all the countries up to different degrees. It's enough to look, for example, at the transparency, at the corruption perception index, and we will see that actually Romania in the last years has managed to climb in that ranking, not to be the last in the European Union. So this sort of the positive results of the fight against corruption have started to be recognized also outside the borders of the country. And actually, the Romanian know-how in this area is being requested in the region, in southeastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, and probably Laura can tell you more about that.
Okay, well, let's bring in Laura. I mean, what do you make of the political culture and what we're seeing at the moment, also in the bigger picture within the EU?
I think what's encouraging about the current events in Romania is that people take it on the streets to keep their government accountable. You see the puzzle on the face of politicians that don't understand, how come so big numbers are on the streets in Bucharest and in other Romanian cities. I think we are witnessing the birth of a new generation that is not going to accept politicians to do whatever just because they've been voted in power. I think we now understand better that having the right to form a majority given by the electorate doesn't mean that you can burn the country down, that there are limits to your freedoms and to what you're supposed to do as a political party, as a government. We shall see how this evolves. But I do think that this is a maturity crisis that Romania is going through. I'm not worried about this movement being to the right or to the left. I don't think people have strong ideologies in terms of political directions, but they do care about rule of law. And I think if we do have rule of law, then we're going to be safe, even if the right or the left are running the country.
Alexandra, I'm just wondering, sorry, we are running out of time. I just want to quickly get a question into Alexandra. I'm just wondering what sort of impact this will have on relations with the US. I know that you think it might have negative impact on those relationships, and how this will play out in the Trump era at the moment, considering NATO and all the other issues.
We've been watching the statements of the State Department in Washington, D.C. here in Bucharest, and we've seen that the tone is increasingly alarmed by the pace of events and the direction that things are going in Romania. So obviously in Washington, the Trump administration is looking, the officials are looking at Romania with concern, and rightly so, I would argue. Now, the question is whether, how this will play out depends a lot on how this whole crisis will end, because I know that the United States believe that the fight against corruption, having a clean Romania is crucial to its role as a key ally in the eastern flank of NATO. So if, let's say, the ordinances are repealed in the end, which I personally very much hope so, I think that there will be no long-term damage to the ties with the United States. Mm-hmm. However, if the Social Democrats continue on this path to the point where there's no return, then probably we'll need to have a reassessment of the extent to which we can keep the security status of Romania at the same level in terms of its NATO position and its relationship with Washington, D.C.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. Alexandru Coieta, Laura Stefan, and Paul Ivan.
Thank you very much.
And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, please go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. And from me, Jane Dutton, the rest of the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.